Hello? Hello?
Hello.
Oh hey, my group wanted to tell you that we're talking about Aboriginal rights. Hope you enjoy the video, and thank you.
To what extent have these social justice movements been successful? The Aboriginal have very rarely started and been successful with social justice movements, but movements that have been successful were only short-term achievements. An example of this controversy is of the White Paper policy. Both Aboriginal and Canadian citizens were against the White Paper, although policies recognized failures with past policies by the government and socio-economic situation with Aboriginals. It attempts to stimulate Aboriginals again. What are the most significant lessons that we can learn from these movements? The most significant lesson we can learn from these movements was that they were all in pursuit of equality and were successful. The most significant lesson these movements can teach us is equality can be achieved, but it requires passion, motivation, and issue that people can relate to. Other significant lessons are how we can make the future better for everybody. Why is it important to study social justice movements of the past? The importance of studying any social justice movements is to understand our mistakes, avoid making them again, and use whatever we learn from the past to improve our futures. It is important to study the history of Aboriginal rights because Canada is supposed to be a free country, but the colonization of Canada, which was very much the opposite of what the country is now, the unfortunate truth that Aboriginal peoples and Native peoples of Canada were taken advantage of and not treated with respect and do not have equal representation.
What does our topic stand for? Aboriginal rights are one of the most unrecognized issues in the world because of a lack of attention that it gets. The Aboriginal peoples have been through centuries of oppression and discrimination that was started by the colonists of the countries they reside in.
Wait, what? You dummies don't know what colonization means? Well, let me tell you. Definition of colonization. It means it is a process by which a central system of power dominates the surrounding land and its components. Thought you guys might want to know that. Thank you. Back to the video.
As the colonists moved into these countries, they slowly and aggressively took over with violence and then with establishing a government that stripped the Aboriginals of their rights. Aboriginal rights stand for achieving equal and equitable rights for everybody. Whom does it affect, and what is the point behind it? The Aboriginal rights affect everybody because if one country made a difference for or against Aboriginal rights, other countries will be influenced too. The point is to apologize for how we affected them, their culture, and to respect them not just as the ancestors of the land we live on, but as people.
Why did it come about? Well, residential school. Residential school was created to isolate and remove indigenous children from their families and abandon the beliefs of their culture and traditions. The white Americans believed they had the power to remove the cultural background of First Nations, and so residential schools were made for this specific purpose. Christian churches want to eradicate the Aboriginal culture and assimilate them to a much more dominant culture, thinking their culture is much more superior than the First Nations. When did it come about? The first residential school opened in the 1870s, when the federal government began sending American Indians to off-reservation school while being in a war against the Indian Aboriginals. The idea of a residential school was influenced by an education program an army officer created in Indian prison to remove the profile of an Aboriginal. The idea of a residential school was influenced by an education program an army officer created in Indian prison to remove the profile of an Aboriginal. The very first location of Indian boarding schools started west of Mississippi. Schools near indigenous foundations and on reservations were first discovered by religious missionaries who believed that they can change Aboriginal people and their beliefs. That way they can extend education and Christianity to the Native Americans. In this next part of the project, this video describes the type of acts innocent indigenous children had to go through in residential schools in both Canada and America back in the day. But be warned, because what they say is true and truly horrifying to even imagine what they had to go through. All of that just because of their skin color and culture that they look up to.
I was 6 years old when they took me to a residential school. I remember the day walking toward that school with my mother, and it was a silent walk, and I was so afraid. 20 or 30 little kids herded into the showers, and then your body being painted in white liquid of some kind, your hair cropped and then doused in kerosene. And that was pretty traumatizing. The school held roughly 220 people, half boys, half girls, and we were segregated. If I was caught waving at my sister, there'd be a punishment for it. And so as a result of that segregation, I never really learned any social skills that young people should be learning as they grow up. From a religious and spiritual perspective, of course, the churches lobbied hard to convert indigenous people, Aboriginal people. They said that we were heathen and pagan. They targeted language in those things we had learned through all of millennia to know where we came from, to know who we were, as something that had to be eliminated. Before that time, I lived in a place called Guayastums. They call it Guilford Island now. We harvested from the forest all of the animals that we needed to provide us sustenance, and from the ocean in front of us as well, all of the species of whales and mink and fish. And I had a connection to the environment around us. And so after having spent years in those schools, by the time we were ready to leave, most of us were pretty broken. Many of us, including myself, descended into addictions, alcoholism, and violence, and it was pretty difficult. Those schools lasted for over 100 years. There were over 150,000 little children. And the last school that closed in Canada was in 1996 in Saskatchewan. There was a history on this land that had been absolutely ignored. Nobody knew about the residential school legacy. Nobody knew about the intent of the Indian Act, the chronic challenges now facing Aboriginals. And we're starting to accept the idea that we have this shared history for which we all are responsible for. When the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report was submitted, I was in the room when Justice Murray Sinclair, the chair of the commission, denounced Canada. He had just recited a litany of intensive harms against Aboriginal people. And when he said, "Canada, you have committed cultural genocide," there was just a silence in that room, and then all of a sudden it erupted in euphoria. We said, survivors want an apology from the Prime Minister in the House of Commons. And I was there and I heard the words, "I'm sorry," and then I couldn't see because my eyes were just flowing with tears. I was so happy that somebody had said, "I'm sorry." Canada, by the way, is the only Western country that has had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So we're trying to look through a new lens. We and Canadians, we as an Aboriginal, we celebrate each other, everybody cheering each other up as we move toward a more equal, prosperous future for all of us. My name is Chief Robert Joseph, and I believe that truth and reconciliation is Canada.
Now, where's the apology? The only apology given was when President Obama signed an apology to Native people of the United States on December 19, 2009, into law during the Department of Defense Appropriations Act of 2010, and creating a new law to ease up the treatment of Native Americans. The law was irrelevant, and Obama signed the bill in private without a ceremony or announcement to the people of the United States. Unlike in Canada, where the First Nations and Canadians came to an agreement allowing survivors of residential schools to specify their settlement go towards funding programs aimed to heal and help survivors and their families to recover from the trauma they once faced before from residential schools.
How are the issues of the past manifested in today's society? Students are being taught of the history of the Aboriginals and how they suffered by the actions of others. There are museums all around BC dedicated to Aboriginals to teach their culture in a way where everyone can enter and understand what they went through. Also, there are documentaries such as Utopia and books such as The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian. There's also an event called Orange Shirt Day to promote awareness about the residential schools that impacted the indigenous communities for more than a century. Orange Shirt Day was started by Phyllis Jack. She wore an orange shirt day on her first day in the residential school and was taken away from her. History of Aboriginals in Australia. There are two groups of Aboriginals in Australia. First, Aboriginal people. They are the first people of mainland Australia. Second, the Torres Strait Islander people. They are the first people of the 274 islands in Torres Strait located in the northern part of Australia. When the British people started to colonize Australia in 1788, around 750 Aboriginals were said to have lived there. They were called stolen generations. The Aboriginal Australians were put in adoptive families and were forbidden to speak their native language and practice their culture. They were often given a new name and abandoning their last. Some Aboriginal Australians resisted and fought for their land, but around 20,000 of them died trying to protect their land. Most Aboriginal did not have full citizenship or voting rights until 1965. It was between 1910 and 1970 when the government forcibly removed Aboriginals from their families and homes. It's always good to know your privilege because as long as people see you as part of the majority, you will benefit from it and be protected from any oppression. Let others know what their privileges are. talk to them what your privileges are, and maybe try to do the privilege walk to see just how much privilege you all have. Be open-minded. Don't judge others based on their appearances and because they're not what you expect them to be. Avoid stereotypes towards a certain race or religion because judging a person's life situation and personalities based on their appearances and stereotypes is simply dehumanizing.
Oh my fucking god. Mommy! Nhìn nhỏ đắp cái cửa! Oh hey guys, this next section of the video is about Aboriginal histories in different continents. Listen closely. Thank you. Aboriginals in America. Residential schools only exist in America mainly because the Americans believe they can strip away the First Nations' dignity of violence because of the War of 1812. The War of 1812 was a desperate struggle for freedom and independence for the Native Americans to fight back against the United States alongside with the British, securing and supporting the nation for their own war against the United States. The Aboriginals were involved with the War of 1812 because the First Nations and Métis community had similar goals like the British, and that was to prevent American expansion. A brief history of Canada's Aboriginals. The Canadian government and European Canadians, ever since the late 18th century, have been encouraged to assimilate what the Europeans considered Canadian culture onto Aboriginal people. They attempt to try to fully assimilate the Aboriginal people with different policies that focus around Christianity, work, agriculture, and education. These attempts became more systematic after the establishment of a European governing body in 1867 with the Indian Act in 1876. The Act would use specific laws that strip away rights from the individuals that did not convert to Christianity. The Indian Act would be adjusted throughout the years to try to ban social events like the potlatch and requirements that make holding an Indian status more difficult. The government has also done things like deliberately made Aboriginals and Canadian citizens different and the image of Aboriginals as savages. Policies were created to make mobile Aboriginal groups stationary by introducing reserves. Residential schools were also introduced to strip Aboriginal children from their families in an attempt to teach them the life skills they would require to join Canadian society. Throughout all of these movements, Aboriginal people have been signed to stop attempts of assimilation by the government, and only in specific instances have reacted. Recent years have shown that the government now shows concerns and effort to try to fix the problems related to Aboriginals, including living conditions of reserves, fair representation in government decisions, and elimination of the Indian Act to make all Aboriginal Canadian citizens. Now, on to another topic about Aboriginal rights, and that is the lack of health care being provided to them. So, what is the issue, and where is it taking place? Throughout the years of the First Nations' first arrival in Canada, they lack taking care of their own health, or the government will lack providing health care to the Indigenous community. A majority percentage of the Indigenous people, where they lack of health, only will result in death, where they will not be provided any support by the government, and this is happening all over of Canada. Now, here's a quick video to show you guys.
Michelle Lebrec was recently found to have a fractured pelvis, but it took 3 trips to hospital before she received that diagnosis.
You're not treated as well as like the white people that come in, and a native are just seem to be turned away.
Not her first bad hospital experience. Once, she went to see a doctor about stomach pain. They discussed her drinking problem and homelessness. He gave her this. When she complained, the hospital apologized, but she felt humiliated.
It's discriminating against natives, I'm pretty sure.
Discrimination against Aboriginal people is in fact pervasive in the healthcare system, according to this new study, which says ongoing racism has had a major impact on Aboriginal people's health.
The study's author suggests many healthcare workers have, quote, unconscious pro-white biases.
It bothers me that people think that it's okay to pretend that we don't have these issues in our own backyard.
The study found Aboriginal people often just avoid medical care to avoid discriminatory treatment.
Some other medication that I take and use.
Carol McFadden put off breast screening for years after a doctor suggested she needn't have come to a clinic for examination. She recently discovered she has stage 4 cancer.
You're somebody that's wasting their valuable time that they could be spending on, somebody else more deserving of the healthcare system.
As for solutions, the study recommends cultural safety training for non-Aboriginal health professionals and
we have the cedar, there's some sage in here.
applauds steps like this, a newly created sacred space at St. Paul's Hospital where patients like James Raven, HIV positive and suffering from hepatitis C, can use traditional Aboriginal medicines.
I feel that if it wasn't for the Creator and these people that are here today, I would be pushing up daisies.
Here, they say, when healthcare professionals and patients work together, all kinds of healing takes place.
Mama takuyase.
Duncan McHugh, CBC News, Vancouver.
Why do the Aboriginal people lack healthcare? Well, Aboriginal people have been trying to gain access to healthcare for years back in the past, but each time were denied by the government, discriminating them based on their skin color. The government will label the Indigenous community as hopeless, apathetic people due to their bad habits of drinking and dosage of drugs, and so they are oftentimes seen as invisible people. However, whenever Aboriginal people seek for assistance, they will be discriminated and left with no help to be provided. The main causes of poor Indigenous health can be attributed to social and economic exclusion, unemployment, low income, poor housing and sanitation, poor education, and lack of adequate nutrition. But whenever these types of issues get worse, the Indigenous people will avoid medical care to avoid discriminatory treatment by the white people, and so they are left to suffer in their own illness. Now, which Aboriginal groups are involved? First Nations were not the only one where they lack of health, but Métis and Inuit people too. They would suffer from issues like external causes, diseases of the circulatory system, and neoplasms. Such examples like accidental alcohol poisoning, intentional self-harm, cardiovascular disease, and various types of cancer. The causes where it led to death weren't insisted by the government in the past, where now in present time, the Canadian government have improved providing a reasonable amount of medical care for Indigenous people. Some Canadians were embarrassed to even be considered as the top friendliest country, as they couldn't even take care of their own people, whom they share land with for many years. What are the ways that Aboriginal groups are active with this issue? As time passes by, the struggles of being provided health care for Indigenous people has improved. First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people have come to an agreement with the Canadian government during 1975 by signing the James Bay Agreement, where it was considered as the first official modern-day treaty to be signed and agreed on. This provided them with school boards and health care for Indigenous groups in Canada. This gave the Indigenous people an opportunity to be healthier and live a better life, but it wouldn't have been possible if they hadn't gotten the attention from other people by protesting in cities. Another way to obtain health care would be living on reserve lands as well, but if you didn't live on the reserve land, you wouldn't be provided health care by the government. Why is this issue important to Aboriginal people involved? Well, health plays a huge role for everybody, of course, but especially the Indigenous people, as it heavily affects their lives and the upcoming generation of the Aboriginals. It's to be said that the Indigenous community is one of the youngest and fastest growing community by far, and more than half the population of Indigenous people in Canada are under 15 years old, where the future of the Indian culture lies in their hands for it to be passed on to the next coming generation of Aboriginals. So, it is time Canadian schools and the government is putting in resources and time into fixing the issue that come along with Aboriginal rights. It was not always so optimistic.
The BC process of treaties. Stage 1 of the treaties is State of Intent, where the Aboriginal people submit a statement with the BC Treaty Commission. Stage 2, Readiness of Negotiation. Within 45 days, the Aboriginal people
Canada, and BC conduct a meeting to share information about the treaties. Stage 3. Negotiation of framework agreement. The three parties establish procedures and a table of content. This is also the stage where the parties must have a public information program. Stage 4. Negotiation of an agreement in principle. This stage identifies agreements of rights and obligations, including existing and future interests in land, sea and resources, structures, and authorities. Stage 5. Negotiation to finalize the treaties. The new relations and agreements among the parties will be finalized. The treaty will be signed and formally confirmed at the conclusion of this stage. Stage 6. Implement of treaty. All aspects will be realized to carry out the treaty, and the new relationships between all three parties will be brought to a maturity.